into the dust.
For today's archaeology porn, we are going to closely examine something which should be truly exciting for all you sapiosexuals out there. It's a first for humanity, and that would be the first known example of the printed word, and that would be found on the disc of Phaistos. So, what is the disc of Phaistos? When and where was it found? How is this an example of the printed word? I've got all the details. Let's dive right in.
34 years of age, Jeremy Wells.
So it's called the disc of Phaistos, or the Phaistos disc, because it was found at a palace by that name on the southern coast of Crete. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into all of the history because I've actually covered that pretty well on this channel. And that would be Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. Specifically, this would be the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, which flourished from approximately 3100 to 1150 BC, so about 2,000 years. However, we are particularly interested in what's known as the Palatial period, starting in 1900 BC. Now, if you want to know more about all the details of this, you can check out my episodes on my site visits to Knossos, or to Mycenae, or my feature on those gold signet rings. Anyway, the point is, this area was chock full of archaeology. Now, the Minoan civilization had 5 known palaces. That would be, of course, Knossos, the big one, as well as Malia, Gornia, Zakros, and Phaistos, which happened to be the only one found on the southern coast of the island. That Agia Triada site you see close to Phaistos was probably not a palace in and of itself. It seems to have had a relationship with Phaistos, perhaps as a elite country estate, for example. Okay, so back to Phaistos. Once upon a time in 1908, Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier was doing his first excavation there at the palace. And the details are a bit sketchy, but recognize that this was the early days of archaeology, when recording practices left a lot to be desired. So because of that, even the archaeology superstars of the day, like Arthur Evans and Heinrich Schliemann, were open to accusations of fakes and forgeries, but a little more on that later. What we do know from the records that Pernier did leave, which were supposedly good for his era, was that this strange disc was found in an enclosed basement northeast of the main palace area. In this diagram, that's where sort of area B is. The room contained both ashes and burnt bovine remains, suggesting that it was used for maybe sacrificial or some kind of ritual purpose. And you can take a drink. The site had been disturbed, though, during antiquity when some ancient people decided to plop a house right on it, so the stratigraphy is a little messed up. And for that reason, the exact dating is unclear, though based on the evidence that was found with the disc, it probably had to date somewhere between 1850 and 1400 BC. So one of those pieces of evidence was a linear A tablet found right by the disc. Okay, so pause. We are actually going to take a little diversion now into ancient languages of this time. So there are 3 known written scripts from the Minoan civilization. The oldest, Cretan hieroglyphics, resemble a little bit Egyptian hieroglyphics, which is not that strange, because the 2 civilizations did have contact. We know that from Egyptian artwork of the time. However, these hieroglyphics have not yet been deciphered. Then there's linear A, but we actually haven't found that many examples of that, and those we have found tend to be short, just like the tablet we found along with the disc of Phaistos. Moreover, it's a complex system, linear A is, and it's believed to contain syllabic symbols representing a whole syllable as opposed to just a sound, logograms representing a word, and ideograms representing a concept or an idea. So it's actually quite complicated for such a small number of examples, and they're short that we found. Hence, it also has not yet been deciphered. Then there's linear B, which we have thousands of examples of, many of them lengthy. These are those tablets with lots of palace records and accounts, which were often found in the basements of the palaces. And this was actually deciphered by Michael Ventris in 1952. But what's so crazy about this disc is it's literally covered on both sides with this unknown script that at the time no other examples of which had been found. And to make matters worse, remember, it was found alongside a tablet of linear A, a script which has not yet been deciphered, so that can't provide any clues. And hence the meaning of the Disc of Phaistos has remained a mystery to this day. So let's get into the specifics of this thing. It is 6 inches or 15 centimeters in diameter, and as I mentioned, it's covered in both sides by these strange symbols. There is a continuous spiral line that radiates out from the center, which on side A sits this rosette symbol. There are these radial lines that are believed to denote words. These oblique lines that some people think represent paragraph breaks. And the text is believed to begin on this dotted line at the edge. Now, why do we think this is the beginning of the text and not the end? Well, there are some examples on the disc of overlaps between adjacent characters. Well, when you look really closely under a microscope, you can see that the characters on the outside going inward clockwise were written first. And as for those characters, there are 241 of them, though 45 distinct kinds, meaning on average each one is repeated just over 5 times. I went to college. I can do math. However, that average masks the fact that some of them are quite common, while many of them appear just once or twice. For example, the most common is the plumed head, which appears 19 times, the helmet that appears 18 times, and the so-called shield, which appears 17 times. On the other hand, 9 symbols like child, captive, or bow appear only once, and 8 other characters appear just twice. And as for the ones that appear only twice, all of them except the so-called manacles appear on only one side. So the manacles appear on both sides, but all the other characters that appear twice are twice on a single side. Also, some characters seem to appear in pairs. So for example, we have the shield, which of the 17 times it's on the disc, 13 of them is right behind the plumed head. So perhaps that indicates something like a soldier or a general or an army, but that's just a guess. However, let's not get too wedded to these names of the characters. It's true, some of them like plumed head or woman or hide seem pretty obvious. And that last one, hide, it might look abstract, but this was actually quite a common motif in the ancient world. For example, even iron ingots were later shaped like ox hides when they were traded. However, how about some of these others? Beehive, ship, horn? Those seem like kind of stretches, but there really isn't much else to go on. One thing that seems likely, though, is that there is some connection between these symbols from the Disc of Phaistos and Linear A. After all, not only were the two scripts found in the same context, but this analysis by Brent Davis strongly suggests that the two scripts actually shared some characters. Now, back to my question in the beginning. Why is this considered the first example of the printed word? Well, these symbols were not scratched into the discs by a stylus, for example. They were stamped on while the disc was still wet. It's made out of clay. And that's exactly kind of the definition of printing, stamping of letters and words to make a text. So to give you a sense of the timing, this Disc of Phaistos thing is like 3,000 or more years older than the Gutenberg Bible, which of course was printed on Johann Gutenberg's first modern printing press, at least in Europe, which came out in the 1450s. Man, ancient Greece was mind-blowing. And as for the clay on the disc of Phaistos, it's not entirely certain that it was meant to be fired.
Fired. You're fired. You're fired.
So why would it ever have been left unfired? Well, if you remember all of those linear B tablets from the basements of the palaces, those were actually left unfired, kind of malleable. And the reason was they were annual records, so they were meant to be written over each year. And the way they eventually became fired was that the palaces burned down. And recall, too, that the disc was found amongst ashes and burnt bovine remains. So it's possible that the disc was fired in a way that was accidental or incidental. Now for the big question. What does it mean? Well, nobody really knows. There have been a few theories, some plausible, others not so much. Some claim the stamp symbols merely represent names. Now, if you remember the other type of stamp we've seen from this time period, those would be the seal stones or the signet rings, which were essentially personal identifiers, or maybe an identifier of a class like an accountant, meant to be a signature on documents that they'd been reviewed or maybe agreed to by that person. And perhaps if the disc was meant to be burned along with those bovine remains, it contained the names of maybe donors to the temple or something, in whose name the sacrifice was being made. I've seen another theory that it actually represents astronomical phenomena like the Saros cycle or eclipses, but you know how I usually feel about these archaeoastronomical assertions.
Bullshit, 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 bullshit.
However, the question of authenticity that I raised earlier, at least that seems to have been resolved. You see, the uniqueness of this item, the fact that the records of its excavation were less than airtight, and it occurred at a time where there really were forgeries and fakes going around, that for a long time cast doubt on Luigi Pernier's find. And as I said, such doubts even ensnared the likes of Evans and Schliemann. However, some recent evidence seems to have exonerated Pernier, the way it actually has done for Evans as well. As we discussed on that episode about the signet rings, Evans acquired one that was unbelievably large and totally one of a kind, dubbed the Ring of Nestor. It seemed just too good to be true. It was too big, too elaborate, too one of a kind. Well, the recent finding of the Griffin Warrior tomb, which we discussed here, that put a lot of these doubts around the Ring of Nestor and Evans to rest. Because what it showed was that the rings inside really could be quite large, quite unique with unfamiliar styles and motifs, and really quite bling. No need to suspect forgery. Likewise, with the disc of Phaistos, there was the finding in 1934 of a double-headed axe that bore some identical and or similar characters. For example, the plumed head, the carpentry plane, and the lily. And there was a Minoan seal stone found in 1955 whose symbol seems to match that of the comb. So that's some pretty strong evidence to suggest the disc of Phaistos is real, enough to convince most scholars, actually. But oddly, the Greek authorities won't allow it to undergo thermoluminescence dating. Now, I think we discussed that on this channel in the context of those ancient hominin carpenters, but that's a way that clay can actually be dated, or more precisely, the date of its firing. And if you think about it, all of the artifacts bearing these similar symbols seem to be religiously linked. For example, the disc of Phaistos may have been found amidst bird offerings. A double-headed axe is in and of itself a religious symbol. And the seal stones were often sort of signatures of officials, like high priests and priestesses. So my hypothesis as to why this script is so rare is that it was an arcane form of writing meant to be understood by a few, the most elite, which in Minoan society were basically the priestly class and officials. For instance, if you think about the Druids, they never wrote anything down because they didn't want people to discover their secrets.
My baby's got a secret.
So this very rare system of writing, which apparently only appears on special religious objects or the possessions of elite and religious people, may have been kind of the same thing, a form of language only meant to be understood by a select few. Anyway, that's just my guess. Let me know what you think in the comments. Now, you have got to see this thing. It is amazing. And luckily, it's located right in the Heraklion Archaeological Museum, which is actually pretty small compared to like the Louvre and the Met and the British Museum. But you can actually spend like the whole day there because it has almost all of the treasures of Knossos and the Minoan civilization in it. There's the gold signet rings, the bull jumping motifs, the famous modernist-looking frescoes, all sorts of incredible statuary. And while you're in Heraklion, you can pick up a disc of Phaistos like yourself. For example, these lovely coasters. And honestly, I never go for the tchotchkes, but I was there during the winter time and there were no other tourists around. So the hawkers looked so sad. I felt pretty bad and I bought some stuff off of them, which is why going in the winter is a travel hack for me in Greece. Great weather, no tourists. Anyway, that museum is definitely not to be missed. But before you go there, you're going to have to calm yourself down because you are going to be hit with pure, unadulterated archaeology porn. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.